Today, so I would like to welcome you in Venice, and I would like to welcome you at the Monastery San Nicolo. As you can hear, I have an accent, a French accent. I'm sorry for that. Nobody is perfect, but that's that. So welcome to Venice, welcome to this summer school. It's the 7th edition of the summer school, and the title of the summer school is Human Rights as Our Responsibility. And that's true that we are all human beings and we have responsibility. We have responsibility to protect human rights, and we have responsibility to defend them when others, the rights of the others are not respected. So we thought that the title was very interesting and reflects perfectly well what we want to do during the summer school, to teach human rights in order for you to protect them better in your life. EUC, it's a very strange name. It means European Inter-University Center for Human Rights and Democratization. It's an old center. We were founded in 1997. And we are specialized in academic activities. We are managing masters all over the world, because we have one master, the first one, the pioneer one, called the European Master in Human Rights, which takes place here in Venice. We have a master in South America, in Buenos Aires, a master in South Africa, a master in Sarajevo, and a master in Yerevan. In Asia, and then we also have one in the MENA region. So that's what we are doing. We also participate in very important research projects, and we organize also training sessions. We have training sessions on European questions, but also more general questions. Training session that we organize all the year long. I would like to thank all of you for being here. Madame Brás is here today. I would like to thank her first. This afternoon you will have also a fantastic, how do you say, fantastic person, okay? Besides. Personality, thanks a lot, personality. So today you will have two personalities. I don't know, no, I don't think so. Sachs came already 2 years ago, 3 years ago in Venice, and the students were totally under the spell of Sachs. I hope it will be the same for you. Mrs. Brás, thanks a lot for coming. It's a real pleasure for us to have you today. You did a lot of things in your life, okay? So I'm not going to explain to the students what you did, because they have your CV in their folder. But what I would like to underline is that you were part of the UN Committee on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, that you were rapporteur of this committee. So economic and social, cultural and social rights, you know everything about it. So you are big specialists on that, and I really would like to thank you to open the summer school, explaining us what kind of challenges today we are facing, especially with economic and social rights. Before giving you the floor, Alberta, you want maybe to add some?
No, I mean, as far as the logistics of the organization of the school, it's going to be ready to help you out with all your questions, we hope. It's myself, Serena, and Roberto, who you probably talk to most of the time, who's not here because he's on his way with Judge Saxa, who just arrived at the airport. So for whatever you need, we'll be available and hopefully also able to respond to all your queries and doubts. Enjoy.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for the introduction. It's a pleasure really to be here. I enjoyed this part of my life very much. The exchange with the younger people, with people who have a different, maybe a different standpoint on many different things, because there are generational differences in spite of it all. And I think in relation to economic, social, and cultural rights, however much I'm grateful to Professor for the introduction, I think we are all specialists on economic, social, and cultural rights, because it is that set of rights that really matters in everyday life. And therefore, I can't think of anyone that does not have some experience, good, bad, so-so, in terms of enjoyment of economic, social, and cultural rights. I just want to do a quick check here. We don't have the time to go through a personal introduction, but just for my, for clarity in my mind, I wanted to see the difference in terms of regions. How many people come from Europe? Could you put your hands up, please? All right. That would seem the great majority. Africa? Well, you have quite, well, you have to be a strong minority. Asia? Not bad. And I suppose there's no one from Australia. No? Because it's also Asia, but sometimes you have this tendency to put them in a different grouping. Well, so now, like Laura said, I am a member of the UN Committee on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, but that is like a second hat I wear, because my first hat is I am a social policy advisor to the government of Portugal. I live in Lisbon. I was born in India, in Goa, in a former Portuguese colony of India, of Portugal, and then I grew up in Goa, and I've been living in Lisbon for 40 years now. So what I wanted to do with you today is to have also an understanding, a feel of what is your understanding of economic, social, and cultural rights. All right? Because I think we all know that there are old challenges, new challenges, ongoing challenges, challenges that depend on cultural context, challenges that apply across the board, challenges that affect particularly certain groups. So if I said to you, if I gave you like a theme, a changing world, in terms of economic, social, and cultural rights, what does immediately come to your mind? And we're going to put it down on the flip chart. Okay? So this is my question. It is for you. Economic, social, and cultural rights challenges. In whatever way you can think of challenges. What comes to your mind without very much thought processing? Almost spontaneously. What are the ideas that come to your mind? And I'm going to write them down. Okay. Who goes first? Maybe your African colleague, because you have to be a strong minority, right?
I think I would say non-justiciable.
Non-justiciable. Can everyone see?
No.
No, so we'll have to find that. We'll have to find a better position. I hope I don't find to destroy this. But you can see now. Can you? Does that work for you guys?
Not at all.
So what do you want to do?
Pardon, I have a suggestion. If
Yeah.
you change the marker to black,
Yeah, I will.
you cannot see the red.
That is fine. I will change the marker. But what about the placing of the chart? I'm sorry, I don't have black, but I use blue. Fine? Well, what was with you?
We're alright.
You won't be alright with this.
Because there is.
Now?
Thank you, it's much better.
And you? It's okay? Bring your chairs a little closer. Correct? Okay. Next. What else? Yes, please.
Availability of resources.
Availability of resources. Oops. That's what is probably. Okay. Availability of resources. What else? Yes?
Sorry. Non-enforcement. So they've been declared but not enforced.
Non-enforcement.
Equality in terms of access and enjoyment.
Quality of access.
Gender discrimination.
Sorry?
Gender discrimination.
Gender discrimination.
Information asymmetry.
Sorry, could you speak a little louder?
Information asymmetry. Other people just don't get to know that.
Sorry, I didn't get the first word. Asymmetries, I thought, but
Information.
information asymmetries.
Politicized.
Yeah?
Politicized.
Politicized. All right. So these are some of the characteristics, if you wish, right, of economic, social, and cultural rights. Now just take a step backward and see, what are the reasons for this? What do you think are the changes in the world that have led to this? Sorry?
Cold War.
Cold War. Now I'll use the green, okay? I won't go back to the red, I promise. Cold War.
Colonization.
Colonization.
I would say that the distinction of the concept between the ICPR and the ICPSCR.
Distinction between ICPR and ICSCR. Political rights and economic social rights. Yes?
Economic crisis and austerity measures.
Economic crisis and austerity. Privatization of services. Yes?
Perhaps lack of transparency.
Lack of transparency. But would you say this is specific for one set of rights? Or would you say in general to governance? In general. All right. What else?
Negative traditions.
Negative traditions. You mean cultural stereotypes, right? When you talk about traditions. So let's put them, because you know, it's good to really clarify this, because traditions on the whole are something that people grow up with. It's the stereotypes that then make the traditions ugly sometimes. What else? Yes? Neoliberal political agenda. All right. Anything else? Yes?
I guess in some cases it can also be lack of legislation that actually.
Lack of legislation. Okay. All right. Now, one more step backwards. The big trends of the end of the last century, the beginning of the century. What are the things that we talk about all the time now, or we have been talking about for the last few years.
Global warming,
Newspapers, whatever.
climate change.
Climate change, maybe. Yes. Migration. Yes? War. Conflict, right? And when we're talking of conflict, we're talking of all kinds of conflict, right? Military conflict, ethnic conflict, social unrest, strife, all that come under conflict. What else? Globalization. Anything else you can think of?
Hunger.
Hunger. And what is the hunger issue? Is that we're not producing enough food? Distribution of food.
I would add to that genetically modified products.
Okay, we put it under food GMOs.
I think that's how we try to solve the problem, the distribution
Yeah.
so it's good.
Well,
We'll get into that a little later. Let us stabilize first this general background against which we will look at the challenges for economic, social, and cultural rights.
organized crime.
Organized crime. Corruption. Yeah. Inequality we've looked at before because inequalities, yes, on the whole, right? Across the board, and we will look at how it affects the non-enjoyment of economic, social, cultural rights. But I just wanted the big buzz words or the big buzz concerns. Demographic changes, right?
Urbanization.
Sorry?
Urbanization.
Urbanization. But normally linked to development,
Rapid.
tourism, exodus from rural areas, etc. We consider all that under urbanization. Humanitarian emergency. We can put this, we put conflict, we can put humanitarian emergency. Alright. So we've done this now, we've had the big trends, if you wish, some of them. Then we also dealt with some of the more particular issues, and we dealt with some elements of economic, social, and cultural rights. Would you agree to this division of what we spoke of? Now let me give you my take on the big trends, and I think basically they're the same as yours. So this is my take on the big trends. So as you see, now we have to take this. Alright, so the demographic changes, we have them. I'll just read something quickly to you about the demographic changes, so just that you see how it's going. World's population is expected to rise from 7.2 billion today to 9.7 billion by 2050. And virtually all this future growth will be concentrated in the world's less developed countries, especially in Africa. Now, in contrast, Europe's birth rate has plummeted to an unexpectedly low level in the past few decades. Right? In Europe, only 15% of the population is below age 15, compared to 41% in Africa and 25% in Asia. Europe's population aged 65 and older is projected to rise to 27% by 2050. So, at both ends of the pyramid, right, if you look at Europe, the bottom base of the pyramid is increasing because there are more and more people getting older, and even over 80, over 85, over 90. And that, as you know, takes a huge toll on on social security systems, on health systems, right? Because of long-term care. So there is an increase in age expectancy, but then you also need for public policies to be able to take specific measures for older people. And at the top end of the pyramid, we have less and less children, which means less and less young people, which means less and less workers, which means less and less money in terms of contributions. So see at both ends of the pyramid, we facing a difficult situation. Then the austerity measures and the economic setbacks that we also spoke about, how it has reflected on unemployment and on underemployment, particularly in relation to youth unemployment. You have this happening in almost all the regions. Youth unemployment has taken a huge, it has increased immensely. Then what we're talking of urbanization, that in a broader sense we could call displacement and poverty. You see, in all regions of the world, there's a lot of social unrest and people feeling unhappy because they've been moved away from the places where they live, the local communities, without any free, prior, and informed consent, without any compensation measures, and they've been moved away to build dams, to build gated communities, even as a result of the tsunami and other man-made disasters, and other tsunamis and man-made disasters. So there's a huge displacement issue with people being displaced from their normal areas of living and from their traditional livelihoods to be pushed into cities where there is a lack of social services, a lack of infrastructure. They do not find adequate places to work. Then impact of climate change on vulnerable groups, like we spoke of, and you know that climate change mostly affects people who are poor and people who are marginalized. Globalization, that now I think there is no difficulty and there's no doubt that it did not really satisfy, especially the developing countries, in what they expected from globalization. There was an uneven sharing of costs, and benefits were not equally distributed either. So it was clearly not a win-win situation. And finally, the crumbling of the welfare state. And this is what we will be looking at in a little more detail because it has a big influence on non-enjoyment of social rights. Okay? Agreed? Was anything left out from what we discussed?
Maybe the resources?
The resources. We'll come to resources specifically when we talk of what it means to have public resources for implementation of economic social control. So we'll deal with it in a more specific manner. For the rest, are we satisfied? That this was more or less what we had in mind, okay? We'll talk of the gender balance later, we'll talk of the discrimination later. This is just for us to have a global context against which then we will pinpoint our challenges. Okay? Alright, let's move on. Oops. So, we've talked of the crumbling of the welfare state. If you remember, particularly in European states a few years ago, there was what we call the European social model. Right? And in spite of the differences between the social protection systems, because in Europe we always had 4 different social protection systems, the Northern European, the Central European, the Southern European, and a mix of all of them. But in any case, there was a joint understanding of an European social model. Do you think that holds true now? Well, I see heads going like this, which means no. And why do you think it doesn't hold true now? What are the symptoms that it no longer holds true? Yes?
Because of the neoliberalistic policies.
Right? And what does that mean?
Well, that capitalism has gone like haywire in the world and multinationals have too much power. You know, like the Bilderberg, people come together and, decide to make the world kind of thing. And, well, that's changing the whole paradigm for the welfare.
Okay.
That's been going on for 60 years, right? Like after World War II. So that's the effects of that, the Maastricht Treaty and all that. That's changing the whole paradigm of the welfare.
Correct. So there has been a change in paradigm.
Yeah.
All right? Yes.
Yes.
Oh, but probably the time has come to live by your means, not to spend more than you get.
Well, we'll see about that. I agree that you cannot spend more than you get, but you could probably diversify the ways you get what you need to get. And probably if you look into taxation systems and tax policies, and you look at progressive taxation, and if you get your act together in the sense that you need to generate resources to be able to better allocate them, that is something that we could discuss a little further. But this argument where you can't give what you don't have is true. It's true for all of us. But you can then perhaps rethink why you have what you have. And would it be possible to have more than you have so that you could give what you have? And that is something we'll also look at. All right? Okay. So you remember that for some time then, after we stopped talking about the welfare model as such, or welfare state, we began to talk about welfare society. And that was a time when there were in many countries like that notion of back to basics and return to the community. And for example, in terms of institutionalized persons with disabilities, that was not a good system to do it anymore, but they could go back to the community and to the families. But then the question was, but who is the community? The community is made up of people, or made up of families, and they need support. For us to take persons with disabilities and move them back to the families, it is not as if the families one day wake up and say, well, now we have an extra task. They need to be supported, they need to be prepared. So it's not a matter of letting go for the state and pushing it to the society. The state still has a role in terms of preparing, in terms of supporting, and that was like a little here and there, all over the place. And then we started talking of the welfare mix, which was part state, part society, part public, part private. And many of these public-private partnerships did not really have achieved the end goal they were meant to, right? So the public funded, invested a lot of money, always thinking that private management is better, right? That is not always true. And the accountability mechanisms were not strong enough. So the public-private partnerships in terms of social care, in terms of welfare, did not yield the end results they were supposed to. And this understanding of the core responsibility of the public and the private sector, is a delicate balance. Of course, for human rights, everyone has their own responsibilities. Professor Demarco spoke of human rights are everyone's responsibility, but it's not the same degree of responsibility. And therefore the public powers and the state are, in the final analysis, they have the final responsibility. And not always does it hold true today. In part because of what we just discussed, privatization, the neoliberal policies, the issue of resources, the understanding that the market economy will take charge of it all. In the final analysis, everything will be solved. Some will suffer for the benefit of others, but it's always the same the same group of people who suffer. So the issue of public responsibility and the role of the state has been weakened, and it has had a toll on economic, social, and cultural rights. All right? Then let me move on. Here's that sheet. All right. Would we agree till now, or is there anyone who wants to? Having said that we deal with the resources, we will deal with the inequalities and discrimination later. Generally speaking, are we happy with this general overview? Okay. Then let's move on. So let me go back to what some of you said a little while ago in terms of non-justiciable, non-enforceable, the nature of economic, social, cultural rights. Let me give you something on that. All right. This is something the High Commission for Human Rights at the time, in 2008, said something about the nature of economic, social, cultural rights. Take a quick look. Is this still true? Is this still true in theory? First question.
Well, I would say for the progressive jurisdictions, we're changing, but it's still not grappled with physically.
So maybe we would say it's no longer true in theory, completely true. In reality, is it still true?
Well, I should say in Europe, for instance, the contrast of these two sets of rights were kind of blurred by the Convention on Human Rights that includes both civil, political, and some economic, social, cultural rights. Not all of them, of course, but to some extent, the West has kind of tried to fuse them all into one document.
Yes, but in reality,
Well, in reality, it's enforced by the European Court.
well, it's enforced by the European Court of Human Rights and there's the European Committee for Social Rights. But generally speaking, do you think governments consider both set of rights equal in importance in implementation?
Maybe also depends on the region, because in Asia there is a focus on economic and social rights, whereas political rights.
Well, it depends on the region. Anything else?
Well, some countries who are vertically efficient in some sort of certain kinds of basic rights, if they try to get involved in some sort of paint washing, in giving civil rights, like gay marriages, for instance, then it would be highly oppressive on other kinds of minority populations. So
Yes.
some topics seem to be appealing for some governments to divert attention on other issues.
True. Well, my experience at the committee has been that there's still a certain very difficult position on the parts of states, not in terms of rhetoric. In terms of rhetoric, of course, both sets of rights are equal, comparable, importance, etc., etc. But in reality, you still have countries where many of the economic, social, cultural rights are just constitutional rights, are not even constitutional rights. Correct? And in many countries, for example in India, they are directives for state policy, which in the final analysis, we know that some of these rights have been even made justiciable by the Indian Supreme Court, for example, or by the South African Constitutional Court. But in terms of government policies, there is a difference between what is civil and political rights that are constitutional rights and within what is economic, social, cultural rights that are directives for state policy. That gives you a notion of where the difference lies. And exactly where does it lie? Is that when you're talking of policies, they are normally linked to resources. When you're talking of rights, they have the possibility of being claimed. So it's still true that in many countries, economic, social, cultural rights are still relatively vague, aspirational, subject to progressive realization, though the rhetoric has changed. But if you look deep down at the policies and even deeper down at allocation of resources, then you realize that it's still very much a provision, a separate set of rights that does not call for application, for implementation, for justiciability in the same way as civil and political rights. All right? Now let me move to the covenant, because I think it is the covenant that finally sets this on the right, what do you call it, sets both at the same level. Because you have the covenant of civil and political rights, and you have the covenant of economic, social, cultural rights. Okay? So the covenant entered into force in 1976, and it has now 164 states parties. The last to ratify was South Africa after a 20-year consideration process. And one of the reasons, we come to that later, when we talk of the core violations. So after 20 years, South Africa has finally ratified, and the last was South Africa and Belize were the last states to ratify. And what was still more important to bring economic, social, cultural rights on par with civil and political rights was the communications procedure, the optional protocol to the covenant that was adopted in May 2013 and that has now been ratified by 20 state countries. All right? So this possibility of a person who considers himself or herself a victim of violation, being able to present a communication or a complaint to an international body, finally made it clear, in addition to all the cases that were adjudicated by the national courts and regional courts, this made it clear that at the international level, both sets of rights were of a similar nature. We'll talk about the protocol more in detail a little later because it's really one of the big steps forward. All right. So if you look at the covenant, and I tell you, I probably am a little prejudiced on this, but I think the covenant is one of the most beautiful international rights instruments because it deals, for one simple reason, it deals with everyday lives, right? And even in countries or in parts of the world where civil and political rights are at a relatively high level of protection, for example, European countries, I don't think there's any European country that can say that economic, social, cultural rights have the same degree of implementation. In spite of all the economic progress, in spite of all the welfare models, there are still pockets of poverty, there are still groups that are discriminated, there's still inequality in the enjoyment of rights, which shows you that even if your civil and political rights are at a considerable level of implementation, that is not always true for the other set of rights. Alright, so the covenant it's an international agreed framework, of course, but it has all these rights that deal with everyday lives of normal people. And I sometimes have this joke. For some people, civil and political rights are about life in capital letters. And economic, social, and cultural rights are about life in small letters, because they're normal people's lives. But everyone has a small life letter, a life written with small letters, and probably not everyone has life written in capital letters. So this is really the covenant that applies to everyday lives of everyday normal people, right? And it has these two cross-cutting provisions, which are the cross-cutting provisions of the covenant. What are they? Non-discrimination and equality, right? And we were talking a little while ago of the discrimination issues. So non-discrimination and equality, and it's specifically under Article 3, equality between men and women to the enjoyment of all economic, social, and cultural rights. Alright? So you have in Article 2.2 of the Covenant this long list of grounds for discrimination, which come from the Universal Declaration, which are the same as in the ICPR, in the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, and which have been also taken up with some additions in the other human rights instruments. How many human rights instruments, core human rights instruments are there? 9, right? Could you tell them off to me, like, without having to consult anything? So you have the 2 covenants, right? That are called the mother covenants. Then you have the 2 mother covenants, then you have Convention Against Torture, Rights of the Child, Disability, Convention on the Protection of all migrant workers and members of their families, CEDAW, third, racial discrimination. Yes, CEDAW, discrimination against women. I think that's the 9. And forced disappearances, right, which is the latest. So, and these grounds for discrimination have been the ones used in the Universal Declaration that are picked up in the 2 mother covenants, have then been added on in different other international human rights instruments. Age was added later on, probably in the Migrant Convention. Then you had disability added sometime later. So some of the grounds have come up later. The committee has, and you know that this Article 2.2 provision lists all the grounds for discrimination, and at the end you have and any other status. And that was, I think, a brilliant move by the drafters of the Universal Declaration and the Covenants. And why would you think, would you agree that it was a good move to keep any other status open? Why didn't they identify all the grounds for discrimination? Why did they leave it open? To be flexible, exactly. Because as everyone understands, and probably they understood at that time, discrimination is an evolving concept. And therefore, you may have grounds for discrimination today that did not apply 60 years ago, or that will not apply 60 years from now, hopefully. So, the committee took that any other status formulation and added, based on our experience, on our dialogue with countries, we added 2 new grounds for discrimination, and that was sexual orientation and gender identity, and the other one was social and economic situation. Because as we know now, discrimination and poverty and discrimination go together very closely. So, discrimination can be a cause for poverty, poverty can be a cause for discrimination, discrimination can result from poverty, and poverty can result from discrimination. So there's no doubt of the close connection between the two. So the committee added social and economic status in the grounds for discrimination. What forms of discrimination can you think of?
In education.
In education?
Gender.
In?
Gender.
In gender?
Employment.
In employment. Well, in economic activities or the economic sectors. But what are the ways discrimination can be exercised?
Either directly or indirectly.
Directly. What is an example of direct discrimination?
Refusing to, I don't know, to employ a woman.
Yeah, only men can apply, for example. What other forms of discrimination do you know?
Age.
Age, yeah. Age is ground for discrimination. It is an express ground. I'm talking of the forms of discrimination. One is direct. What else? Perhaps it's indirect discrimination, what you're talking about. And what is indirect discrimination?
Applying criteria that though they appear
Gender neutral? Yeah.
in fact result in the marginalization of
Certain groups, okay? So, indirect discrimination is something that, at face value, it seems neutral. But when you go a little deeper, then you see that's not neutral. I will give an example. For example, pensions, right? You need to have, for example, 15 years of uninterrupted work. Only men have them because women have childbearing periods, have childbearing periods. So, at face value, it seems neutral, but in reality, it has a negative impact on certain groups. What other forms of discrimination can you think of?
Formal equality and substantive equality.
Formal equality and substantive equality, that has to do with indirect discrimination, right? But what other ways? Can you think of multiple discrimination, for example?
Racial.
Or compounded discrimination?
Yes.
Racial.
Yes, and what would be compounded discrimination? Racial,
Gender.
plus gender,
Religious.
plus religion, plus disability, plus poverty. So, you know, all the levels go like they compounded on each other. And that makes for multiple discrimination. And that is difficult, more difficult than direct and indirect, because it comes from a number of grounds, it comes from a number of directions. So the policies also have to come from different points of view. What else? Systemic discrimination. Have you ever thought of that? What is systemic discrimination?
Voter registration?
Hmm?
Voter registration, what you need to register to vote.
No. What I have in mind is systemic discrimination is something that is so ingrained in the system that you don't even realize it's there. Segregation, for example. It's so much part of your DNA sometimes that you don't even realize you're discriminating. Right? Take discrimination based on sexual orientation. In certain societies, it's so much a matter of societal understanding that you don't even think it's discrimination. And that is the hardest to fight, obviously. because it's not even understood as being discrimination. Alright, so these are the 4 forms of discrimination we could think of for the time being: direct, indirect, multiple, and systemic. Okay? Now, why do you think Article 3 of the Covenant deals specifically with equal enjoyment of economic, social, cultural rights by men and women? If sex is already a ground for discrimination in Article 2, why do we need to have another article specifically for men and women?
Because it is the most widespread, discrimination on the ground of sex is common.
Well, first of all, women are more than half of the world. Remember? You know? That is an important issue. Secondly, sorry?
Also the 70% of the
Also 70% of the poor. But also, because in an ideal world, Article 2 would be sufficient. And in an ideal world, probably, we would not have to have a specific convention for women, a specific convention for migrants, a specific convention for persons with disabilities. Because all of them have civil and political rights and social and economic and cultural rights. But the need for specific groups to feel, to want to be better protected, was because we do not live in an ideal world, but in a real world, where the 2 covenants were not enough to protect specific groups. Alright? In the same way, Article 3 is just a reinforcement of Article 2. Sometimes you have people asking, why would you need Article 3? Sex is already there. Yes, but for the reasons we've just indicated, Article 3 is a very important cross-cutting provision of the covenant. And it is particularly important because then you need to look at issues that affect discrimination of women under all the rights of the covenant, to work, to health, to education, women and other discriminated groups. Alright? I don't like to say women and other discriminated groups because I want to hold on to this that we are half of the world and therefore we have a different situation. But in any case, the fact that you have a cross-cutting provision means that women's rights and the rights of disadvantaged and marginalized groups have to be read through all the other specific rights. So it's not only a matter of discrimination, but it's also a matter of substantive equality. It's also a matter of proactive policies, of temporary special measures. It is a matter of bringing the discriminated groups into mainstream policies. Because you can't have policies on the right to work, you can't have policies on the right to health, if you do not you cannot have sound, sustainable policies. You can always have policies that are not sound, but if you want sound, sustainable policies on the right to health, to work, to education, etc., you need to have all the groups mainstreamed into those policies. Would you agree? Yes. Okay. Then there is this reference to human rights standards of participation and accountability. And that goes back to what a little while ago we discussed in terms of lack of transparency in governance on the whole. And that is something that is deeply, that has a deeply negative impact on human rights. Right? Because first of all, accountability and participation are 2 sides of the same coin. Right? If people want to feel their voices are really heard, not token participation, not this false participation, but if people want to feel really involved and want to feel that their participation matters, then you have to have the accountability of the duty bearers. You have to show rights holders that what they are saying, that what they are thinking, makes a difference to the way you articulate and you draft your policies. If not, it becomes token participation. And then you often have, for example, young people say, why should I vote? They all say the same. They all do the same. They promise everything, but when they come to setting policies, there's hardly any difference. And one basic reason for that is that people don't feel their participation matters, and therefore they don't feel also the participation in the electoral process will matter. Correct? And there can be nothing more prejudicial to human rights than lack of participation and people feeling that their voice doesn't matter. Because if there's one thing which is important about human rights, it is that it's about the lived injustice of each one of us. Maybe sometimes the lived injustice is not real, it is perceived, but never mind, it's there. And therefore human right means that your lived injustice, whether real or perceived, makes a difference. And if participation really doesn't have that kind of an outcome, then people sooner or later give up. talk a lot of the issues that hinder accountability, not only bad policies, not only badly prepared professionals, not only lack of understanding of the importance, also corruption, taxes that do not work correctly, people putting their money in offshores and outside banks, whatever, you name it. And if you have the time, you could go into it. But here, the issue is just to call attention to cross-cutting principles, which is non-discrimination, gender equality, participation, and accountability. So, we spoke a little while ago of the fact that the responsibilities of states and of other partners or non-state actors was not at the same level. I think that doesn't require much discussion. It is obvious that you cannot have everyone with the same level of responsibility. People vote for governments, they don't vote for other actors. So in the final analysis, we vote for a government that then is accountable to us. Now, what are the levels of obligations that government has, or that states parties have? I have to tell you, I come from a public policy background, and I don't very much like boxing these things, because it doesn't always correspond to what life is about. Our life is not boxed. So obligations also are not boxed. There is a certain enchantment about life that doesn't go in boxes. But this is useful for us to hold states accountable. And that is why I have now become a huge fan of these boxes. Because they've allowed me to understand what exactly are the levels of obligations of government. Right? The first level is to respect. Respect means governments do not interfere. They do not lower the level of protection. Do you think that's true nowadays? Look at the austerity measures. We'll talk about it a little more in detail. Right? How the level of protection has been lowered. There's an issue of resources, of course there's an issue of resources. But are the right choices being made all the time? Do human rights come into the equation? Is there a consultation process that allows governments to listen to what people have to say? Right? These are some of the issues we will deal with. Now, protect, which is the second level. Prevent third parties from interfering. Who are these third parties? Non-state actors. Examples?
Companies.
NGOs, yes.
Corporations.
Corporations. Private individuals. And in corporations, what do you have? National corporations, multinationals, right? Financial institutions, IMFs, World Banks, and the like. Non-state actors, right? So you have third parties that are not state that interfere with the enjoyment of economic, social, cultural rights. Sometimes they interfere positively, sometimes they interfere negatively. I'm not making any value judgment now. We will make value judgments later. But at this point in time, we just want to identify non-state actors. And it is the duty of the state to protect everyone living under the jurisdiction of the state, and that's an important point also in the covenant. The covenant doesn't only apply to citizens, like other human rights instruments. It applies to everyone living under the jurisdiction of the state. That could be citizens, of course, but that could be refugees, migrants, irregular migrants. I am not saying that they all are protected at the same level. What I'm saying is that the covenant does not allow anyone to remain unprotected. Alright? So, it's not the companies that have ratified the covenant. It's not the companies that come to the committee and we have the dialogue with them. Right? It is the states. But the states have a duty to protect against the violations by non-state actors. And the third level is the level of fulfillment. Correct? It is what makes rights real. You can have a beautiful article, constitutional article. I give you an example of my own Portuguese constitution, which was drafted after our revolution in 1974. It is beautiful. It's a beautifully written constitution because it was, in the fourth revolutionary period. So there's a huge call for universal public policies. And everyone's entitled to the right to social security. And that is good. But then, that in itself just establishes the constitutional protection. But then you need to move on. There has to be a framework law, the social security system, there have to be regulations, there has to be universal coverage, the benefits have to be adequate and in amount, eligibility conditions need to be good. So all that comes from the constitutional provision, but there's more to come. Right? And that's what fulfillment is all about. In law and in practice. You can have the most beautiful laws, but if there's no practical implementation, it doesn't help much. You need the constitutional provision, you need the laws, but above all, you need the implementation. That is what fulfillment is all about. Fulfill. Right? Make them real. And under fulfill, you have two types of obligations. Core obligations and progressive realization. What does core bring to your mind? The notion of core. Minimum standards. What else?
Foundational values.
A little louder.
Foundational values.
Foundational values. What else? What is core of something? Intrinsic. Something that's intrinsic. Right? Would you also say something that is essential?
Yes.
Right? So that is what a core obligation is about. It's about the essential level of the right. The minimum essential level. I have a little difficulty with minimum essential. To me, essential is either minimum or maximum. It is essential. But that is the way it is spelled out. Minimum essential level of the right. And would you give me one or two reasons why this is so important? Why is this essential level so important?
Because it is independent from the resource required.
Independent from resources. We'll come back to that. What else?
It's the grounding, the foundation.
It's the grounding, the foundation. What else? You can't derogate from this obligation. What else? To prevent retrogressive measures. Who does this core apply to? Who is in need of the essential? What are the groups in need of essential? The vulnerable groups, the discriminated groups, those who have fallen through the cracks of policies, right? It's for them that this essential matters. Because those who are already at a higher level of protection, then they've already passed that stage of essential. But essential is connected to what we were talking about, is this individual perception of human rights. Okay, so this notion of essential is very important, and it is non-negative. You cannot, being core, being essential, if you go below it, then there's no dignity in people's lives. And then, having ratified the covenant doesn't mean anything. It is deprived of any meaningful content. Okay? And then you have progressive realization, which is, as the concept indicates, you protect better and better. And for that, you need resources. Right? You need resources also for the essential. But there's a different degree of urgency to the essential that progressive realization is of a slightly different nature. And then under under the fulfilled dimension, you have three little sub-boxes. And that is to provide, to facilitate, and to promote. There are three ways of fulfilling. To provide is for those who are unable to do so, and an example could be persons with disabilities, for example, who cannot access rights for a number of reasons. Or positive measures. Could you give an example of positive measures? Quotas, temporary special measures. Quotas, right? For discriminated groups or for women to have a voice in decision making. Alright, so positive measures generally are temporary special measures. And then education, information, campaigns, etc., which is to promote. So these are the two subdivisions of obligations. Now, in relation to core obligations, I think we've gone through them. satisfaction of the very least minimum essential levels. And see the way it is formulated. At the very least, minimum essential levels. So you can really understand that it is the bottom line. Below that, there is absolutely no enjoyment of a life in dignity and no enjoyment of non-social cultural rights in a way that is meaningful. And that can be done either through legislative measures, I gave an example of constitutions, framework laws, regulations, etc., and national strategies and plans of action, which is among the core obligations that in the general comments of the committee drafts general comments, which is the interpretation of the committee on the right. Because some rights are very spelled out. We are presently working on Article 7 of the Covenant, which is the right to just and favourable conditions of work. And that is almost half a page. So it's really spelled out. It has reference to fair wages, minimum wage, not exactly minimum wage, but fair wages. Yes, a minimum wage that shows an adequate standard of living, weekly leave, hourly leave. It has a huge equality in promotion. So it is very spelled out. And then you have an Article 9 on the right to social security, which is just one line. And which says everyone's entitled to the right to social security, including social insurance. Right? So the committee, all treaty bodies, then have their own interpretation of what those rights mean. And in our general comments, under core obligations for states, we always raise the issue of a national strategy or a plan of action. Because that would require consultation, that would require long-term vision, right? That would require allocation of resources. So it would be a kind of a blueprint for the implementation of the right. And a third aspect which is fundamental is the judicial or other remedies. Right? Because there are some remedies, of course judicial remedies, which is access to justice, go to court and claim your right. But then there are other remedies which could also be useful in terms of compensation to potential to victims, compensation or reparation or rehabilitation. And there can be non-effective remedies. For example, government instituting a program for instituting a set of measures for a specific group of people in a specific locality. So there could be non-effective remedies too. In terms of non-judicial remedies, in terms of judicial remedies, I'm sure tomorrow we have the privilege of listening to Judge Harry Sachs is going to give us 6 landmark cases from South African Constitutional Court. That will be, I'm sure, brilliant examples of how rights were made claimed and were made real. But there are many examples in many different institutions, for example, in National Human Rights Commissions, ombudspersons, offices of non-judicial remedies. Okay? Alright, in terms of progressive realization. So this is the article of the Covenant that talks of progressive realization. Right? What are the important elements for you in this article? Now look at remember our concerns, remember our global trends, remember the elements of the rights we picked. What would be for you the important elements in this article, in that context? Achieving progressively the full realization of the rights. Right? So it's progressively, but what do you want at the end? The full realization. What else?
Individually through international assistance and cooperation.
Individually and through international assistance and cooperation. What does that mean? It means that the state has national responsibilities, right? But if at its own level it's not able to allocate the resources, then it has the possibility to seek international assistance and cooperation. What else? Maximum available resources. And that ties to the discussion we had a little while ago on allocation of resources. What does the Covenant call for? Maximum available resources. Now, the question is, do we stop at the available resources, or do we look closer and why only those resources are available and not more resources? Like I said to you a little while ago, you cannot give what you don't have. But you can look at better ways and more funding sources, better allocation of resources. And for that, there's one issue at heart of this whole thing, and that is how relevant economic, social, cultural rights are in national policies. Do you spend more money on defense? How is your corruption? How are your corruption measures going? How is your taxation policy? When you allocate resources in national budgets, how do you allocate resources to social policies? What do you privilege? What do you prioritize? And I tell you, in my experience of the committee for 10 years now, what I've heard from most states is that, first of all, there's this understanding that social policies will come after economic development. First, let us have economic growth. Then we'll distribute. And in reality, that does not happen like that. Because even countries with economic growth, right? Countries with sustained economic growth, the trickle-down effects are not clear. In many countries, there's been a huge strengthening of the middle class, given economic growth. But the trickle-down effects, those who really need the resources, that is not clear. Right? In terms of affecting or allocating resources to health policies, what do you privilege? Do you privilege private hospitals? Do you underfund your public policies? In many cases, there's been a shift towards privatization of health services, and as a result, the government has underfunded the public sector. Because more people can go to the private hospitals, we don't need to spend so much on the public system. And as a result, what happens? The private hospitals are too expensive, so not everyone can access the private hospitals, right? And because the public system is underfunded, the quality is low. So, in the final analysis, it's the rights holders that get pushed against the wall. So, there are many issues to look under when you talk of allocation of resources. There's no one answer, but it's also not a blanket excuse, we don't have the resources. Okay? So, now, in terms of maximum available resources, it isn't as if the countries can do this, as they wish. And I tell you also, in my 10 years of the committee, I've never had one. Oh, let our colleagues come in such a big group. Good morning. So you would not have a late flight, that's all? Did you come on a late flight? The flight was supposed to come earlier. No? Never mind, we came together. So, as I was saying to you, I cannot remember, in my 10 years of being at the committee, I cannot remember any country that has not done something. There's a 5-year period in between the reports. So countries will report now, and then the committee will issue some concluding observations and make recommendations and suggestions for some policy gaps and other issues, and then the country will return in 5 years. Right? So in the 5 years that go between one report or another, there's not one country that has not done something. Now the question is, has it done enough? And we're talking of enough. You're not saying enough. You're saying enough within the context of maximum available resources. And that, no country has done enough. Not one. First of all, because the understanding of maximum available resources is not there. Secondly, because of the austerity, many of the measures have undergone retrogression. And thirdly, and we'll talk about it a little later, is because progressive realization has come to a kind of standstill. Okay, so I think this first bullet point is important. There's no bullet point, but the first sentence is important. Because it says the availability of resources, although an important qualifier for the obligation to take steps, does not alter the immediacy of the obligation. And look at this last part. Nor can resource constraints alone justify inaction. And that is very important. A government cannot say, I'm not doing it, we are not doing it because we have no resources. You cannot have inaction just due to insufficient resources. The government has to prove, the state has to prove what it has done to raise resources, what it has done to generate resources, what it has done to better allocate resources. Right? So just saying, we don't have resources, therefore we cannot do anything. That kind of argument is not compliant with the government. Second aspect, even in times of severe resource constraints, the most disadvantaged must be protected. And that makes perfect sense. Because that is connected to the core obligation. You see that link clearly? Yes. And thirdly, all steps should take into account situations of deprivation and exclusion, and this is linked to the second issue. So, under all circumstances, the goal is to be respected, and the availability of resources by itself cannot justify inaction. Are we clear on this? Because this is fundamental. To many of you who will probably later become policy drafters, judges, NGO leaders, human rights activists, this is fundamental that you keep in mind. The notion of core and the notion that just resources or insufficient resources by itself cannot justify inaction. And that is important for all of us to have clear in our minds. Okay? Alright. Then you talked about official development assistance a little while ago. Because the government has this Article 2.1 that had been read out a little while ago that calls for official development, official assistance, international assistance and cooperation. Now, this is also an interesting issue because this 0.7% of gross national income has been there forever as a commitment from the richer countries. And so far, only 5 countries have complied with it. Norway, Sweden, Luxembourg, Denmark, and the UK. These are the only countries that have complied with this 0.7 commitment in international development, in official development assistance. And now, the argument for many countries, even from the European countries, is that they're not in a position to increase ODA at this point in time because all their resources are being spent nationally in terms of strengthening social spending, etc. And then there's also the role played by international finance institutions, bilateral donors, and recipient countries in terms of protection of economic, social, cultural rights. We often hear in the committee, recipient countries tell us, well, we cannot do much better because we are tied down by conditionalities in international aid. Right? And that's an argument for sure. But when you draft bilateral and multilateral agreements, trade, economic partnership, whatever, you need to have the human rights obligations at heart. You have to remember that. Be it recipient countries, be it donor countries, be it financial institutions, right? If there is this understanding of the supremacy of human rights, then you need to take that understanding into your agreements. You can't have the human rights policies go one side and your trade policies go somewhere else, which happens in many places. It's the finance and the economy ministers who take care of the trade and the economic partnerships, and they have the line ministries, labor, education, health, whatever, looking at human rights. And then it doesn't work. Because one hand is undoing what the other hand is giving. Or one hand is giving and the other hand is not taking. So there is the need to bring all this together under the supremacy of human rights. And unfortunately, that is not what we see most of the time. You take in now the austerity programs under the IMF. The first issue is cut social spending. At the top of anything else, either because you have too rich a system, or because your eligibility conditions are too broad, or because your benefits are too big, or because you're covering everyone and there's a lot of spillage. For whatever argument, it's always the social spending that gets a cut, gets it in the first place. And then the next issue is the move towards privatization. What is happening now? A lot of the African countries in terms of privatization of education. I don't know where your colleague comes from. Where do you come from?
So?
Bissau?
I was asking if you were referring to me, but
Yes, to you.
I'm Nigerian, like
Nigerian. Now, this last time we had conversations with an NGO that deals with privatization of education on Kenya and Uganda. And there's a whole move of the World Bank towards privatization of education. And the argument is that it only takes $6 a month, right? But $6 a month for a family with 3 children is a lot of money, correct? And what is happening as a result is that the national governments are underfunding the public system because they're saying private education is now accessible to everyone. So we will not build more schools, we will not invest in qualified teachers because after all, you have a private system which is accessible and which can take care of it all. It doesn't happen like that. Because first of all, the quality is not guaranteed. Secondly, when there are economic problems in the family, it's the girls that fall out in the first place. So it's not really a win-win situation. But there's this whole move towards privatization. And as a result, underfunding of the public system. Because if there was privatization and the public system was still strong, then there would be a choice. But that isn't the fact. Because the more you invest in privatization, the less you invest in the public system. Okay? Alright. So I think that is now actually, yes, we can. That is by way of the general context of the covenant, of the implementation of the rights, of the obligations of states, right? And now let's move on to the challenges as such. So, I picked a couple of situations where the challenges are really at the forefront, right? There are ongoing challenges in the implementation of economic, social, cultural rights. I would dare say in all countries, on an ongoing, permanent basis. But there are some countries in specific situations that are faced with additional difficulties, right? So I picked a few of those countries to have this exchange with you. Many of you, or most of you, come from European countries. Not all of you have undergone austerity measures, but some may have undergone austerity measures. And you know what that has meant, right? That has meant, like I said, cutting social policies or underfunding social policies and weakening the universality of public policy. So more and more people fall out. Like if you look at unemployment benefits, the eligibility conditions are so stringent, hardly anyone qualifies. Then if you have benefits for 20 months, now you only have benefits for 15 months. Those under 25 do not qualify. Different ways of saving money, right? But is that what is needed? In times of austerity, on times of economic difficulties and hardships, is it not the time for people to be better protected than when there is no hardship? That would seem obvious, right? But there is no, I think there's not been sufficient investment in countercyclical measures. So you come to the point of when the austerity measures come down on you and the systems are just not prepared. So everything begins to fall apart. We have had plenty of examples. I think if there are people from here from Spain or from Greece, they probably share the same thing as I have in Portugal. So all our public policies, our protection systems took a huge hit. Now, we're moving to the economic recovery period. Have you learned anything from that time? Well, very little. But let's look at the austerity first. So, what does it mean for the covenant to be implemented and to be respected in times of austerity? Because many countries said, well, we're in an austerity situation, or we fear that we will be in an austerity situation for some years from now, so we need to take measures. What does it mean in terms of being compliant with the covenant? So at that time, the committee wrote a letter to all states in 2012, spelling out 4 criteria that, though we recognize that there are economic deficits that call for difficult measures, still there is a certain number of criteria that states have to respect if they want to remain compliant with the obligations under the covenant. One was the minimum content of the right, which we all discussed a little while ago, and we know why it's important because it protects the most vulnerable. Second, non-discriminatory measures. They have to be temporary, last during the period of the crisis, cannot go on forever, even though the crisis is ended. Must be necessary and proportionate, meaning that if measures were not taken, it would even be worse. Gender perspectives must be taken into account, obviously, because in many of these countries, it's the women who also suffered because of the employment situation, right? Because when there is a lot of economic hardship, normally it's the women that have to stay at home and take care of the children because there's almost no money for social services and childcare and this and that. So there is always a gender perspective. And then international assistance and cooperation as a fundamental obligation. So these were the 4 criteria that the committee spelled out and said why we recognize that the covenant is not being implemented in an ideal world, but in a real world where economic hardships exist and governments have to take measures. Then, if governments want to remain compliant with the covenant, these are the criteria they need to respect. So now, yes, please.
Sorry, but just to be clear, I mean, this letter was sent by the committee
To all states, right? To all. Those who were under austerity, those who intended maybe in the future they would be under austerity, those who probably did not fear austerity, but took advantage of the fact that there was austerity to lessen protection. It took all kinds. Right? So we wrote a letter to everyone, all the states, saying, we recognize the difficulties, but if you want to remain compliant with the covenant, this is what you need to do. It's a letter of 2012. I think 12th June in 2012. But it's on the website if you want to take a look at it. Does this make sense to you? That the committee would say something like this? Or do you think this is interfering in state party sovereignty?
I think it's a protective umbrella that's necessary.
Protective umbrella that is necessary. Does anyone disagree? I would also like to hear people who disagree with this. It's why the committee has to interfere what governments do under terms of austerity.
Just being conscious of the states, they should stick to it. They're not obliged to do that by definition.
They're not obliged, but they should stick to it. Yeah, that's already midterm. Anyone who says no, the states should be able to take their own decisions. I have had people say, no, this is too much. Nothing on you, but probably because you're more familiar with the issues. But you see why the committee could not remain absent in this discussion is that the committee's role is to guarantee, to monitor the implementation of the covenant, right? And the covenant is not only implemented in times of abundance. The covenant, once ratified, is forever. And therefore, there are times of abundance and there are times of hardship. But it remains real for everyone all the time, provided the states agree to remain compliant with the covenant. And therefore, many people would ask the committee, what do you think of these austerity issues? How far do you think governments can derogate? What kind of measures can they take and still remain compliant with the covenant? What types of policies should they privilege? So, and this is of course what we also do in the context of the dialogue with the state. But this is a general reminder to all states. that in times of austerity, this is what states need to do. said to you, another challenge we face with is progressive realization. I think the crisis and the austerity measures had probably a good result, not a good result, that's not the right way of saying it, but I think one of the things that became clear to states is this notion of core. Because under the austerity programs, there was this need to be particularly attentive to the needs of the most disadvantaged. And therefore this clarified the notion of core in a way that probably in times of abundance would be clear. But because everything was geared to the minimum, it made countries absolutely clear on the need to respect their core populations. That was probably something that was good. Everything can be good in this context. But what suffered a lot was progressive realization, because all countries said that we cannot do anymore. Right? We can, or we try to honor our core obligations, but in terms of progressive realization, there is very little we can do. So progressive realization has come to a standstill. And that is worrisome for the future. Because like we said, it is the full implementation of the covenant that matters. And if you do not progressively realize the rights, of course you make choices, of course you set priorities. You can't do it all, you can't do everything at once. But you need to have this consistent effort at improving policies, at better protecting people, at allocating the sufficient resources in a rational way. So the notion of progressive realization, I think, at this point in time, is under question. Right? Also, the need for human rights indicators to evaluate what's happening. Because even countries who say that we are moving somewhat in terms of progressive realization. What does that mean? What does that mean? How are the rights holders able, I'm not even talking now the treaty bodies, the rights holders, how are you able to understand and evaluate whether progressive realization is being done in a consistent, comprehensive way? For that, it is very important to have human rights indicators, and we'll talk a little more of it later. But the other challenge that I also wanted to put here, or to place in the discussion, to locate in the discussion, is the issue of non-state actors, right? And the obligation to protect. Like I said to you, that is the state's obligation that's probably under a greater scrutiny now. Is what exactly states are doing to protect rights holders from violations by third parties. Now you look at all these issues and all these events that happen. For example, Rana Plaza factory issue, all these different issues in different places of the world. And about the role or the power of the private sector. Whether we're talking of national companies, whether we're talking of multinational companies. We now had 7 countries in this last session of the committee. Kyrgyzstan, Mongolia, Thailand, Ireland, Chile, Uganda, and what was the second? Venezuela. Right? And I think there was not one country where they did not deal with violations or with the difficulty and weakness of the state in protecting against rights holders against the corporate sector. Whether it's national enterprises or whether it's multinational enterprises, whether it's cross-border enterprises or cross-border obligations. In Thailand, for example, you have these projects that go from Laos to Thailand, or from Thailand to Laos to Myanmar, so it's all along the route. And where do the obligations lie? Do they lie with the state where it begins? Do they lie with the state where it goes through? Do they lie with the state where the project finally comes to fruition? Whose responsibility is it? Right? If you look at all these multinationals that have seats under a certain country, and then they have supply chains who knows where, call centers who knows where, subsidiaries all over the place. What is the legal jurisdiction of each country? Who can claim rights where? It's a major issue. And states sometimes are at a loss. They really don't know what to do. Because some of these companies are extremely powerful. It's also the states that make them powerful, of course, but they are extremely powerful. So it's a major issue. Under the obligation of the state to protect, and also the extraterritorial obligations, which are becoming more and more important. Right? Like I said to you, these countries that have cross-border obligations or that have obligations to protect rights holders in third countries where their enterprises are developing activities. Right? Okay. Let me go back a little bit to the indicators issue because I think it's important. Because many people say, but there are statistics, and statistics can measure this. Not really, because statistics are not geared to human rights compliance. Statistics can give you trends of progression or trends of regression, but they're not geared to human rights compliance. For example, they will not usually give you the level of implementation of rights based on non-discrimination. Now, some will, very few, but generally they're kind of tendencies, trends. So you need human rights indicators to be able to evaluate implementation of rights. All right? And the Office of the High Commissioner so it calls for human rights compliance, calls for disaggregation and comparability over the medium time frame. So you need to be able to have a kind of a framework within which to evaluate whether what the government is doing, whether if they're on the right path, whether they're doing it using the maximum available resources, whether the discriminated groups are protected. See what happened with the MDGs. Right? The MDGs, even when the poverty threshold I think it's about to be crossed, or it has been crossed already. But who are those people who have, if you want, moved out of poverty? Generally, it is what a Dutch colleague of mine calls the low-hanging fruit. Because, if you just at that line, imagine that you're just 1% below the poverty level. If you get pushed up, that's one more person that has moved out of poverty. What about those who are 5% below the poverty level? Where do they figure in this equation? Sometimes they don't. Because if you go only for the figures, only for the percentage, it doesn't really tell you of how far that percentage is really real for those who most need. Normally it does not relate. Human rights indicators would do that because all the indicators would have to be disaggregated in relation to the discriminated groups. The Office of the High Commissioner is undertaking an extensive study, and they've already published a manual with human rights indicators. Anyone who's interested, I'd advise you to take a look. And they've used structural indicators, which is ratification of international instruments, etc. Then process indicators, which allow you to measure the efforts of governments, and then outcome indicators, which is the results. And many times statistics give you the results, but they don't give you the process. So you're not able to understand or evaluate if the government has consistently complied with its obligations. Right? So if you want to take a look, anyone who's interested in human rights indicators, I'd advise you to take a look at the Office of the High Commission's website, which is www.ohchr.org, and take a look. There's a manual and there's a lot of information on human rights indicators. And that is the way for the future. Yes, Linda, please.
Yes, I wanted to ask because, well, we very much support this work on indicators, and we've been involved also in the process on the new Sustainable Development Goals, and have been pushing for disaggregated data and new statistics, if you will. And the response from many countries is that it's illegal according to their legislation, and that disaggregating data would in fact put people, some groups at risk of further violence or marginalization. So what is your take on that?
Well, my take on this is that this is already a known and exhausted argument. I understand this argument would perhaps make sense years ago. And I say would perhaps, but I'm ready to give in to that. It makes no longer sense now. One of the issues is, for example, this is an argument that's very much used by the European Union in terms of racial discrimination. That it's not proper to identify groups as racially discriminated because of self-identification, etc., etc., etc. But I think if you really want to look at human rights compliance, you need to have disaggregated data. Because otherwise, you're not able to assess whether the policies you're taking are really protecting the groups most in need. If you do not know, if you have, take for example, a plan of action on poverty, right? If you don't know who are the people who are going to be covered by that plan of action, and where do they live, what are the communities they belong to, are they discriminated in the general sense of the term or not? Do they belong to, or do they live in a region that is discriminated in terms of resources? All that is needed if you want to have a really effective plan of action. Because otherwise, it's just an umbrella kind of policy which doesn't really help you to understand if it's being useful to the most discriminated. I don't see any problem in people identifying themselves as discriminated groups. I think that requires some preparation on the part of the state, right? I imagine that in some countries with racial tension and strife, they would have to look perhaps for other alternatives. But in Europe, honestly, I don't see the point in not having disaggregation of data according to discriminated groups based on the grounds in Article 2 of the Covenant. I really don't see it. I really don't see the need. An additional issue, the European Union is now a stakeholder, not a state party, a party to the Convention on the Protection of Rights of Persons with Disabilities. And I'm sure that is one of the issues the Disability Committee is going to bring up. What is the European Union going to answer? I don't know. I'm going to sit there, but I wonder, because I think these things are changing. And maybe this made sense some years ago, but I don't think it makes sense anymore. I think more than ever, if you want to have SDGs that are targeted, if you want to have responsibilities on the part of all states towards sustainable development, not only the poorest states, but all states, you need to have an understanding of who discriminated groups are. Otherwise, I don't think you will be very effective in your policies. That is my take. Let's see how this argument progresses. But I have a feeling when the Disability Committee starts pressuring for discrimination or for data based on discrimination in relation to CRPD, I have a feeling these things will move. We'll see. We'll see. All right? So, we've done with the indicators. But we've also spoken of the non-state actors and extraterritoriality. Are you familiar with UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights? And I'm sure this will be part of your course also, because you have one part of the course that's dedicated to business. Right? So I'm sure you will go to that in detail. I just want to remind you that it was an important call for attention the guidelines, because for the first time it made it clear that non-state actors, or that the corporate sector also has responsibilities in terms of human rights. I would call them obligations, although at a different level from states. Right? That they have the obligation to respect. The state has the obligation to protect, which is to create the enabling environment. Right? The corporate sector has the obligation to respect, not to violate. Respect meaning not to violate the rights of individuals, and to remedy. So if a violation occurs, then the corporate sector also needs to have a first possibility for remedies. That UN guidelines made it clear, because till then there was this whole academic discussion, but there was no real grounding. And I think, though perhaps they could have gone further in terms of human rights, but in terms of establishing the responsibilities of the non-state actors, of the corporate sector, I think the guidelines were not good. There is also another document, which is the Maastricht Guidelines on Extraterritorial Obligations, which was drafted and is kind of supported by a group of experts that deals specifically with the extraterritorial obligations of states. And you know that not all states agree that they have extraterritorial obligations. There are still some states that say the government they need to comply with the government within their frontiers, within their boundaries. But I think also more and more states now progressively understand that there can be no boundaries for human rights. You cannot do to third-party rights holders what you don't do to your own. If you have, for example, take a country like Finland or like Sweden or like Norway or like the Netherlands, whoever, that has a company operating abroad, and that company does not have the same level of health and safety at work or safeguards in terms of unemployment or dismissal that it has, or that it creates environmental damage, you know, that in a way derogates from the level of protection that they have in their own country. It doesn't make sense. Imagine you have very huge environmental safeguards in your country, but then in the other country, because the legislation in that country is not so strong, or because there's a possibility to generate resources for some, whatever, that the safeguards don't apply there. So their water gets contaminated, food is contaminated, something that in your country of origin would not be tolerated. So you can't stop at what is within my country and what is outside my country. The understanding of economic, social, cultural rights as for everyone also means that you hold responsibilities for what your companies do abroad. And I think that is now becoming more an issue of discussion, right? I'm not saying we will agree on this for years to come, but I think it is already something that is on the table. It was not totally visible, because it was strictly states that were responsible for the implementation of laws. Okay, so this is the general, some of the general challenges. I just want to call attention to one thing. I thought I wanted to bring to you some specific challenges relating to one right, just for us to have a broader discussion. And then I thought, what would be interesting for your age group? Perhaps the right to work. I don't know if I'm right, maybe the right to health would be more interesting, but I thought maybe at this, within your age bracket, the right to work would be more interesting. And therefore I brought you a couple of challenges that we faced with specifically in relation to the right to work. One of the issues that for years now, even before those heritage, we had what we call jobless growth. So there was growth, there was economic growth, but there was no jobs created. So there was a huge mismatch between more and more people coming out of universities and professional courses, and there was an insufficiency of jobs in the labor market. Then you now have very much what substandard forms of employment. You know what that is? I'm sure you know, but not all like this. You know, give me an example of forms of employment that are just not right. Unpaid internships. More and more unpaid internships. What else? Part-time professors, or part-time anything, part-time workers. Yes, on the whole, they're not well protected. What else? Have you heard of the zero-hour contracts? You know what the zero-hour contracts are? Something very strange. You have to be permanently available whenever the company calls you, and you have to be ready. But you can go 1 week without the company calling you. Right? So, not only is it a problem for your labor rights, but it's also a problem for social protection. There is no build rights, you don't build unemployment rights, no protection rights. So it's called 0 hours, except that it's 0 hours for you, it's not 0 hours for the company. This company, you can call it at any time. Another issue or another trend is this trade union representation becoming weaker and weaker because there are many restrictions to trade union representation, to trade union formation. For example, in many countries, migrants cannot, they can join trade unions, but they cannot form trade unions by themselves. And because they have particular issues in the labor market, right, even in the informal labor market, sometimes joining other trade unions doesn't help much, because most trade unions are about legalized workers. But they can't form trade unions of their own. In a number of countries, migrants can't form their own trade unions. And then the impact of the corporate sector on working and living conditions, we've gone through this, is this whole notion of having to be available all the time. You know, if you want, you cannot refuse to be dislocated here and there. Never mind your private life or family life. You have to be ready all the time. You can be shifted without much consideration. You can have you can take a hit, for example, in your leave. You can different things. So there's a huge impact of the corporate sector. And the results of globalization, development globalization, and the particular impact it has on women, right? Look at informal economy workers. For years, the committee would recommend that states legalize the informal economy. Now, we ask them to regularize the informal economy because we've seen that the informal economy is there to stay. What is worse, many of the formal jobs are now being informalized due to the austerity and economic setbacks, correct? Then you have workers in special economic zones. You know that most countries have special economic zones or trade zones or whatever they call it, where in most cases there are no labor inspections. It's not that it's not legislation. In no legislation will you find labor inspections will go everywhere except in special economic zones. That you won't find anywhere. So countries will not tell us, no, but we don't have that kind of legislation. No, but in practice, that's what happens. Right? The legislation is that inspectors should go everywhere, but in reality, they will shy away from special economic zones because the labor conditions are different. Okay? And then the new forms of work organization that also affect particularly women. Part-time workers, casual workers, home workers, you know, these piecemeal workers, people who work for contracts, sitting at home. And that means no health and safety at work, means no social protection. It just is that little small amount of pay you get for that task you do. And that is a survival issue. But that is not protection of your rights. Okay, I don't want to end, and I want to leave some time for discussion. I don't want to end without leaving you some positive trends. It's not as if everything is going to be fire. A lot is, but there are also some positive trends. Well, the minimum wage, this is also another issue. You know that in many countries, because of the austerity measures, the minimum wage was frozen. So it took 3 or 4 years before the minimum wages were updated. Right? And now they are updated, so if the minimum wage update today would be what you would need for a decent living 5 years ago. It's no longer what you need today. So there's this gap, and it will take some time before we recover. All right. So I wanted to leave you with some, also with some positive trends. Okay? One of the positive trends, before I even go to the option protocol, is this social protection floor. I am not sure if you have heard of it, but those of you who have been familiar with ILO work may have heard of it. There is this recommendation 202 of the ILO on a social protection floor. And what is a social protection floor? As the word says, it is a floor, which means it's how you begin building comprehensive universal social protection systems. And the floor has 4 kinds of benefits, which is child benefits, access to social services, universal pensions for old age and disability, and family support services, basically. So these comprise, and benefits for the working poor. Because there are many people who are employed, but who still do not earn enough for a decent standard of living. Okay? So these 4 components are parts of a floor. It's recommendation 202 of the ILO. You can read it. have extensive information. So it is 4 elements that are required for a floor. And what the ILO says is that all countries can begin building a floor. Once again, it's not the issue of resources, that all countries, either by themselves or with financial assistance from development cooperation and the technical assistance from the ILO, they are able to start a floor. As we all know, a floor is a floor, it's not a ceiling. But you can't build a ceiling without a floor. So if there is this shared understanding that a floor is possible in all countries of the world, I think that's a really good, positive point. And that this floor covers like 4 types of benefits that really would take into account everyone. Vulnerable people, children, working poor, and families, and access to basic services. That is one good component, and that's, I think, one good element. We in the committee are particularly happy with the floor because we have a general comment on the right to social security, the general comment 19, where we've specified the core obligations of the states. Our general comment was in 2007, and the social protection core recommendations 2012. But they're really interchangeable. So they're mutually reinforcing. What the committee said in 2007 was the core is what the social protection floor is about. And you can see how core and floor go together. So it is for the committee a very important recommendation. We issued a statement a few months in the February session on the mutually reinforcing role of the social protection floor and our general comment for the right to social security and also for some sustainable development goals. Because you know there's this whole discussion now that poverty under the sustainable development goals should have specified criteria to be able to combat poverty, and the social protection floor is certainly one such item. Correct? The other good point is the optional protocol of the government, which entered into force in 2013, and we have just decided on our first complaint last week during the session. It was a complaint brought up by a rights holder from Spain who complained about the denial of the right to justice in relation to, denial to access to justice in relation to right to housing. And I don't know, but I suppose it will soon be out on the website also. It was our first case, and we are happy. We have another 3 cases. No, with this, including this, we have 3 cases on the website. I think there are a couple more, at least 4 or 5 more that have already been sent to the committee, but they have to go first through the checklist for admissibility criteria, whether they're admissible or not. And I'm not sure if all of them are admissible. But this first case was already a strong plus point, and I think it is a sign of hope that at the international level there is a clear way to claim justice. Okay? And the optional protocol gives the committee competence for all these tasks, and I think this task to mediate friendly settlements is also an important task. Obviously, it won't be true for all cases, but whenever the committee can use its good offices to mediate a claim, I think it would be also interesting for us and for the state and for the rights holders. About justiciability. Now, I often have this description of justiciability, this definition, because sometimes the justiciability discussion can become extremely confusing and convoluted and unclear. And I find this definition by the International Commission of Jurists particularly short, sharp, targeted, and to the point. People who claim to be victims of violation of these rights are able to file a complaint before an independent and impartial body to request adequate remedies if a violation has been found to have occurred or to be likely to occur and to have any remedy enforced. I think it's short, it's to the point, and it gives you a clear understanding of how rights can be made justiciable, why they should be made justiciable, and how they can be made justiciable. All right. So we have said this before, that rights require to be realized on the ground, to be fulfilled. That is one of the level of the obligations of the states. We have to have robust public policies. And then this argument that not all economic, social, and cultural rights are justiciable, I think that's also an argument of the past. Many national jurisdictions, many regional human rights courts and institutions have adjudicated economic, social, and cultural rights. The South African Constitutional Court is important, Indian Supreme Court is important. There are many European Court of Human Rights, of course, of many. So there are plenty of examples of the justiciability, and also in most cases there are positive obligations and negative obligations. So it is I think a given, and now all the committee needs to do is to build on regional and national jurisprudence, and hopefully the committee will also influence national and regional jurisprudence. And I want to leave you with two final reminders, I think. One of them is this whole issue of participation. And because you're young and you'll be going out into the world, this whole issue of participation, I want to strengthen this understanding that it is one fundamental element of human rights. And that there is no way any of us can say, oh no, I am not really, it's not my thing, because it's for the governments and I'm not for the government. Or it's for the NGOs and I still have not joined any NGO. Or it is for a national human rights institution and I'm not part of it. Or academia and I still have not become part of academia. So I don't have anything to do with this. That cannot be further from the truth. All of us, each and every one of us has a stake in this. Right? And it is not only token participation, it's meaningful participation. I think you're in a very good position to make this point and to move on with this. In times of austerity, even more important. People don't like to be left out of discussions and of decisions. In many countries, people have said, we did not know austerity measures and all the policy measures that were taken, we were not part of them. It is us who are the right holders, but nobody cared for our opinions. And perhaps this whole austerity business would not have gone the way it went if people had felt sufficiently consulted. They might still have issues, they might still not agree, but they would not be felt, they would not be feeling as left out of this. And that, I think, is something for us, a lesson for the future. And lastly, I want you to leave with one, I think it's an alert really, it's a kind of a call to attention from Mary Robinson years ago. And I think it applies under all circumstances, and it applies very much at times of difficulty. And it says, while the common theme underlying all people's experience is one of powerlessness, human rights can empower individuals and communities. They're not a panacea, but the challenge is to connect the powerless with the empowering potential of human rights. This is a message I would like to leave for all of you. And we have how much more time? We still have some time. We have half an hour for discussion. And I promise to be quiet now. And I will only answer if you ask me something, but I would really like to discuss this among yourselves. Hi, Adi, good morning.
Hi.
Welcome.
Yeah.
How are you? You have the pleasure of listening to Judge Saxon's argument and this evening, and you have late in the week. But I think you've arrived at the right time because I'm done, and now it's for them. I think it's the right time to be very well. All right. So, what have you to say? Yes, please.
I was wondering when you thought of the chances of looking at the provision for the organization of the rights.
Yes.
Because, I mean, as we saw before, I mean, it depends a lot on your private acts and the vision you have for the welfare state. So, do you have, within the company, do you have a vision, or do you have any
what is the full realization of civil rights?
All right. Can I take the question at the end? Because I said I would not speak anymore now, right?
So
I take.
I have a second question.
All right. Then let me just close the door.
And then I wanted to know if you can maybe give some examples of follow-up by state fathers to some of the concluding observations.
Yes.
Happy with that.
Yes, certainly.
All right. So I will note down. So our vision for full realization. Examples, good examples of implementation of laws. Okay. What else?
What it means to be or some institutions of law that have to persuade and to somehow enforce government accountability to respect human rights on their level. Because it seems like we're developing more and more skills and commissions and institutions that are whose role is devoted to defending human rights, but at least the powerful government are going to systemizing this in a very different direction.
Correct. Yes, please.
I want to ask you if do you think it is possible to achieve all these things and preserve the life we're living nowadays? I mean, we have this technology, smartphones, laptops, clothes at a certain price, food at a certain price. I mean, and it's all things, tra virgolette, this inequality. Do you think how will these changes, if they are taken seriously and if they are done, how that will affect the everyday life for the privileged?
For the privilege.
For the privileged and the middle class and all the people that are actually using all these technologies and
Correct. Yes.
Yes, I would be interested in the experience of the committee. I mean, you look at all economic, social, and cultural rights. Do you see that there is more progress on some? Are some being more misunderstood than others?
Okay. Our colleagues who have issues of resources, have I been able to relay your peers, or you still have more difficulties in understanding how can this all be done when there's no money? Yes, please. You've been well set up. I told you from the start you'd have to have a strong voice.
Well, you're going to make any intervention. I was just going to probably talk about the regional courts as well.
Yes.
Like the ECOWAS court and some of the decisions it's come up with, which sometimes can be deemed stronger because of court, as against some of the decisions your committee may hand down to countries in the West, in West Africa, for instance. So, comparing the issue of justiciability, the strength of credence that was given to a decision of the ECOWAS court, even though it's a regional body, but it's a court, do you think it's stronger than what the committees would hand down because it's of the implementation issue? So the ECOWAS court has made declarations concerning the right to education, for instance, and has said that it's justiciable and countries must be bound by it. And comparing how that even CPR rights, civil political rights, also require a lot of resources. Yes. For instance, fair trial or criminal justice requires a lot of resources. So why do we make such excuses when it comes to CPR? States must be doing the same excuses when it comes to PSCR. But primarily my question would then be rights policy is justiciable for ESCR, how do we see issue of enforceability and implementation?
Anything else? All right, then let's take these couple of issues. The vision for full realization. Well, possibly the vision for full realization of economic, social, cultural depends a lot on our individual experience. As a committee, we will obviously advocate for progressive realization using maximum available resources, right? But in specific terms, I think it depends a lot on where you come from and what your background is. For me, my take on this, I come from a public policy background, right? So my attachment to policies is way above anything else. I do recognize the importance of justiciability. I do recognize the importance of adequate compensation for violations. But my point of departure is that violations only occur because public policies are not sound. In an ideal world, you would not have violations. Policies would be able to cover all groups. That is an ideal world. That is fantasy. So you have a real world, right, where violations occur. But for me, maximum or full realization means increasingly more and more sound and sustainable public policies that are universal, that leave no one behind, that are based on grounded research, that have implementation mechanisms, that are evaluated regularly, and that have, as the final goal or as an ongoing goal, the implementation of rights. That is for me what full realization is about. Probably if you asked our sex, you would have a different opinion because of his understanding, his experience probably is different from mine. If you ask any of my other 18, 17 colleagues, probably they would have their own answer of what full realization is. You've asked me, so I've given you mine. And my understanding is that if states really do want to be compliant with the covenant, then they need to have strong, sustainable, grounded, non-discriminatory, universal public policies that cover everyone, like the covenant requires, not only citizens, right? That have at heart equality, non-discrimination, that are attentive to the needs of discriminated groups, that have the right mix of mainstream policies and specific protection measures, that have good human rights indicators. Well, it is an ideal world, but a full vision also is an ideal world. So that is what I can tell you from my experience of life, of work, and of activity. I don't know if that's what you expected, but that's what I can tell you. Good examples of implementation. Yes, we've had a couple of good examples. One example that I remember, and that is always a pleasure, is that the committee has been consistently advocating for a framework, comprehensive non-discrimination law that takes on board all the grounds for discrimination referred to in Article 2.2 of the Covenant. That list of grounds for discrimination. In almost no country has comprehensive legislation. They have regulations for discrimination in employment, they have regulations for discrimination in health, and then some specific measures for discrimination in education. But people still fall through the cracks. So the committee has been advocating for comprehensive legislation that takes on board all the grounds of the covenant, and also the two new grounds that the committee has added in its understanding, in its interpretation of non-discrimination, which is sex orientation, gender identity, like I told you, and social and economic status. Actually, the original idea was about poverty, but poverty is not, the word poverty is not in the covenant, right? It is subsumed under an adequate standard of living. It
Because if you're poor, you don't have an adequate standard of living. If you don't have access to water, access to sanitation, access to clothes, food, you don't have an adequate standard of living. But word poverty as such is not a concept that is, it's not a word that's in the hub. So we use socio-economic status. So, and we have consistently been advocating with countries, explaining to them why we think that having dispersed, scattered legislation doesn't really help, or doesn't help as much as it should, that they should have a general discrimination law. And Norway, our last dialogue with Norway is considering such a draft. So I think if that draft came to existence, really, it would be a very interesting example for other countries. Sometimes we've had examples of computing observations, laws that have been changed, for example. Some discriminatory provisions that were in the law. I'm not talking of de facto discrimination, I'm talking of discrimination in the law. And when the committee has pointed out that for those examples of discrimination, there have been some countries that have outlawed, that have repealed those specific grounds for discrimination. Some countries have put in place specific programs, for example, in terms of protection of children. And I think the issue of disaggregation is also to discriminate so not only for a basic requirement for information, right, factors, is already an important because there are difficulties. The problem
we ourselves have to give up a lot of our own privileges. And that's something that I think people really have to do, and that's the main problem. It's like give up their own rights in order to ensure equality.
Well, I don't know if it's give up their own rights. It's probably give up some privileges.
Yeah, that's what
right? Because I don't think some people can give up rights for other people to acquire rights. That's probably
privileges. Will feel as if it is their right. Like.
Well, but what you're talking of is what surfaces. But the deeper reasons for this are studied and are documented. For example, the issue of unfair trade relations.
Yes, so I completely agree with that, but I think that in practice you will have to convince a lot of people of the necessity of giving up their own privileges.
Probably, and if you look at it from that point of view, but I would prefer to look at it from a more, not an individual responsibility, but as a responsibility of the system as such, and of countries, and of cooperation, and of fair trade conditions. Before you look at individuals and say, well, you have to give up something. Right? Because that can never end. I mean, you can never get everyone to agree that they will give up. But if fair trade conditions were made more fair, if the unbalance between developed and developing states became less obvious, if development cooperation was totally reshaped, because the way it's working now, it is obviously not working well, right? Because you have countries that have even come up to 0.7 GNI, but still you don't see the effects of it. So there's a whole change that needs to be done in the system, which I think is far more important and far more, it will reach further than having to convince individually citizens in countries that they need to give up.
Yes, I understand that as well, but I think the system is only made up of people.
Well, for sure. But I doubt what government can convince the citizens that you need to give up some privileges without providing a strong reason for that. And the reason that there's exploitation in third world countries will resonate with some, will not resonate with all.
No.
Right? So there is this whole move, I think, towards more fair trading conditions, more fair economic access by markets from developing countries, more important space to extraterritorial obligations that cannot only circumscribe the obligations of the state to your country, of that company to your country. You also have obligations where your companies operate in third countries. So I think it's a mixture of all these systemic policies or systemic changes and education of citizens. Probably is where some changes will come finally. But I would say only kind of dedicating attention or only concentrating efforts on changing the mindset of people living in developed countries will not go a long way, because you could change some, but you will probably not be able to change everyone. So as long as there are people who are ready to buy clothes that are made at the cost of bread somewhere, you will always have market for it. So if that is not changed at the level of who produces those clothes and the living conditions for those people, then you're always bound to be in a kind of a path that in the long run will not have profound and lasting changes. Profound and lasting changes can only come when there is a better balance of power between countries, between regions, and so, of course, there's a lot each one of us can do, but it is not a replacement for what is the obligation of governments and country laws.
Yeah, I didn't say it was a replacement, I was just...
They go hand in hand.
Yeah, fine. Yeah, fine.
I wish you the best of luck in convincing your Dutch citizens. Well, the rest of the questions? More progress in some and others misunderstood. Yes, I think one of the rights that has really progressed is the right to education. The right to education, universal education, at least at the basic level, and basic level means at least 12 years, if not 15. That I think has progressed a lot. Now what has increased are the hidden costs of education, right? Uniforms, books. So sometimes universal free education doesn't mean really free. It means free in terms of tuition, but it doesn't mean free in terms of what families have to invest. And that sometimes creates inequality. But in terms of legislation and programs, I think the right to education has moved a lot. The right to health in some regions, and the right to social security is also important. Because I think now there's a common understanding that without adequate social security, there can be no real enjoyment of the social protocols. So that I would say is one of the rights for the future. Now, in terms of others misunderstood. I think what is being now difficult is women's rights. Women's rights are kind of under question and under an unfavorable kind of light. Again, very much related to cultural relativism and to this whole thing about, human rights or women's rights. I think from the West, they don't really relate to regional realities. Of course, we know there's nothing further than it's not true at all. Women's rights and the difficulties women face in exercising their rights, need to go home because there's no longer money to make Judge Saxon from that region. There is strong jurisprudence, right? That is already also for the community to build. Cape Verde and the government. So it's only these three that are ratified. In Asia, we only have Mongolia. No Eurasian country has ratified. There are a number of countries who have Mexico still, but there are a number of countries, but we are particularly concerned about the rate of ratification from Asia. It would be very good for one of the big Asian countries to send a kind of a positive message. Also, Asia does not have a European human rights system, right? So, as I see it, making rights justiciable is something for the courts to do. Right? And enforcing those decisions, then it has to be the state to enforce them. And in some cases, states don't enforce those decisions. There are cases where it has taken a long time and a long process to get states to think of the example of India, that whole case of the right to food, that the court decided that the Indian government had violated the right to food because of the distribution system, and then even designated 4 commissioners to monitor the implementation by the state of the decision of the court. For a long time. And it went up and down, and it moved forwards and backwards. And it had these 4 commissioners dedicated to this issue. So sometimes the issue of enforcement, but that also goes not only for findings of the courts, it also goes for implementation of policies. Right? So how many times you have the most beautiful policy, and then there's no enforcement? There are no indicators, there's no evaluation, there's no accountability. So I would say it applies to cases, it applies to policies, it applies fundamentally to lack of good governance mechanisms. And that is true. I don't think there's any one country that is exempted and that could not do a lot to improve its governance mechanisms. Right? I think maybe would you like to say something?
No.
No?
Okay.
Not yet. Okay. So I think we're done. It's
Say hello.
It's 1 o'clock. We have some time later together, so then we can. So to make this perfectly clear, I don't come from an that gets it correctly whenever what I'm saying is not in really it. But I come from a public policy background, so whatever my take is on this is what I said to you. It is building some policies for rights that is at the beginning of the process. Everything else comes up because that initial step is not perfect. Alright? Thank you very much. And